Hello, and welcome to another video lecture from Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is another one of our part series looking at the United States Civil War. And this particular lecture video looks at draft riots and Union opposition. So let's talk here a little bit about this topic on the U.S. Civil War. The readings for this particular section comes from us from pages 532. And our guiding questions are, why didn't all people of the North support the Emancipation Proclamation? What was the draft? Why did many people not like it? What happened in the draft riots of 1863? Who were the Copperheads? And what is habeas corpus, and why did Lincoln suspend it during the war? So when we think about the United States Civil War, sometimes it's very easy for us to put things into absolutes. We know that the South was for keeping slavery, and we know the North was generally opposed for slavery's expansion. So we tend to put people into boxes, saying the South was the bad guys, the North was maybe the good guys, and the South was very racist because they believed in slavery, and the North was not. And the reality of the matter is in the 1800s, racism really existed on both sides of the line between North and South. And not everybody in the North was an abolitionist, and not everybody in the South was a slaveholder. So it's important to remember this as we think about the reaction of the North to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Not everybody in the North was very supportive of this idea of African Americans being treated equally in the United States. Now, if we think about Northern attitudes during the Civil War and views of slavery, we had talked earlier about a small group of Northerners known as the abolitionists. And even among abolitionists weren't completely unified, but generally speaking, abolitionists were all for ending slavery. And among a lot of the abolitionists, they believed in not only not having slavery, but being able to treat everybody equally. Now, some abolitionists varied between equal, is that just for men and women, or for both, for whites and for African Americans? So you had a little bit of some variation among the abolitionists even on this idea of everyone being treated equally. But that was a pretty small percentage of the Northern population, and even Abraham Lincoln himself would probably not fall under that abolitionist category, at least not when he's first elected president. As the war drags on, he will start leaning more towards this idea of equality, but he will not be there initially in 1860 when he's elected president. Lincoln is probably more like most Northerners. He's in that kind of middle zone where he didn't think slavery was right, but he wasn't quite sure if African Americans should be treated equally under the law as whites. And that was a pretty common belief by a lot of Northerners in this period in the 1860s. And then you had a pretty large majority of Northerners who said they didn't really have a feeling one way on slavery because they didn't have slaves. They didn't know anyone who owned slaves. They didn't know much about slavery. And they definitely didn't think whites and blacks should be treated equally. So if you think about the populations of the North in the 1800s, you had kind of this range of attitudes for many Northerners. So when Lincoln comes up and issues his Emancipation Proclamation, which says that we're going to, quote unquote, free the slaves in the South, in the Confederacy, not all Northerners thought that was a good idea. They were worried that by freeing African Americans, those African Americans would now be competing for the jobs from the Northerners, especially these new jobs in some of the factories and docks that a lot of poor and immigrant populations were serving into. And so the Emancipation Proclamation was not necessarily greeted by a lot of Northerners with wide open arms. To make matters even worse, the popularity of the war and the willingness to volunteer to serve in the Army was really beginning to wane and shrinken by the middle of the conflict. So by the time we get to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 and then the year of 1863, there are getting to be less and less volunteers, especially in the North, to volunteer for conflict. And there is still a need, though, to wage war. There still needs to be men fighting in the Army. So the North and the South, both by 1863, begin instituting what we call a draft. A draft is a system that requires citizens to join the country's armed forces. Sometimes we call these conscription laws, meaning that you are compelled to, if your name gets drafted, you are compelled by law to serve in the military. The Confederacy will pass the first of these conscription laws, or draft laws, in 1862. Basically, it said of men between the ages of 18 and 35 were eligible to be drafted. And if their name was called, they would have to serve at least 3 years in military service. The Union will pass a draft law the following year in 1863. The ages are a little bit different. They will draft those between 20 and 45. And again, they call for about 3 years of military service. Now, these laws were very controversial because both of them had clauses that allowed the very wealthy to basically get out of the draft. Wealthy individuals, if drafted, could avoid war by basically paying for a substitute to take their place. The substitute bounty generally was around $300 to $500 in price, which was huge amounts of money to the average American in 1862 and 1863, and was a pretty large sum of money for the super wealthy as well, but they could come up with that money. So here you have in 62 and 63, especially in the North, a lot of unpopular actions going on. You have the Emancipation Proclamation that not everybody in the North is very excited about, this notion of freeing the slaves and bringing in competition for some of these low-paying jobs in the North. And you have this very unpopular draft where it seems that the poor are fighting in the war and the rich are able to get out of the conflict. This all comes to a boiling point in 1863 in New York, in the summer of New York in July, known as the New York City Draft Riots that take place July of 1863. Northerners were very furious by this draft. They resented the fact they had to fight now to free the slaves and that the rich could basically get out of the conflict. Now, in New York City, you have this combination of a draft being called, people's names being pulled into service, which was created kind of a very angry climate in the streets of New York, and you had a lot of fear that African Americans, once freed, were going to come to the New York harbors and take the jobs from a lot of these low-skilled immigrants that were working in New York. And it just reached finally a fever pitch and just erupted in large-scale rioting that took place. The rioters will go after the draft officers and the police. They will specifically target African Americans in the city of New York. Black churches, orphanages, and boarding houses were ransacked, looted, and destroyed. And African Americans were killed on the street as well. You see this very famous drawing sketch of an African American male being lynched by this angry mob. His body is being set on fire. You see a very angry mob there in the background. These riots will take place for a couple days and eventually will be put down when the military will be called into service to come in and restore order into the streets. So you see this massive kind of angry and violence uprising taking place. New York wasn't the only northern city that experienced these types of draft riots. There were other draft riots that happened that year as well. New York is kind of seen as probably the largest of the draft riots in terms of scale during this time period. So you can see here that the draft, the war, is really becoming more and more unpopular in some parts of the northern states in the U.S. The Republican Party, which was in control of the White House, President Lincoln, who was a member of the Republican Party, wasn't the only political party, though, in the North. You did have Democrats that still existed in the South, or in the North, even though that the election of 1860 kind of divided and fragmented them as a political party. They still existed in the North. And Northern Democrats were very outspoken critics of Lincoln's policies of the war and about the Civil War in general. Many Democrats felt that if the South didn't want to be part of the country anymore, then they should just be on their own. Fine, let them go on their own. We don't need to have this war trying to bring the Union back together if the South doesn't want to be a part of us anymore. And so they become very outspoken critics. They write articles in newspapers, especially in places like New York, which were very strong Democratic areas. They had ties to the South. New York City was really looking at trying to reopen up the cotton trade. They relied as much on the cotton trade as the South did on its exportation to Europe. And so you have a lot of this anger, animosity, being upset, criticism of Abraham Lincoln, and the Republicans begin referring to these Northern Democrats as Copperheads. A copperhead is a kind of very venomous snake that lives in the swamps of the South. And you see this political cartoon here. Here we see the lady in her toga, as we saw in our Manifest Destiny image. Here you see the Star of Progress on her forehead. She's wearing the shield of union and the sword of justice, and she's defending the country from these basically Southern Democrats, and these are actually caricatures of some of the main political leaders of these Northern Democrats being portrayed now as venomous snakes that are trying to ruin the country, weaken the country. So there's a strong opposition that's taking place in the North as well. Lincoln has to make some pretty controversial decisions during the Civil War. He is fighting a war not only against an adversary in the South, but also against growing criticisms in the North as well. And he does something that you could argue saying is very unconstitutional, or you could say even a violation of people's civil liberties. The term we use is called habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a legal term that means that you cannot be thrown in jail without due process. The government can't just round you up and just throw you in jail. But throughout the Civil War, especially in Maryland, Lincoln will at times suspend habeas corpus and will round up people disloyal to the Union and put them in jail. The most famous example of this took place in Maryland. As Maryland was voting on secession, Lincoln, through his encouragement, suspends habeas corpus and rounds up a lot of the secession leaders in Maryland and puts them in jail so they couldn't cast the deciding votes on Maryland's vote for secession. Well, Lincoln does this because, as we mentioned earlier, if Maryland joins the Confederacy, the Union capital is surrounded and the North is going to probably end up losing the war. So you could definitely be very critical of Lincoln's actions, saying that, that he's violating people's First Amendment rights of freedom of speech. He's also violating their rights of due process by suspending habeas corpus and throwing them in jail. There were also northern groups that were very sympathetic to the South. These were kind of like Confederate terrorist groups. A lot of these were kind of based out of Canada, and they would kind of come in and they had plots to burn New York, capture warships of the Union on the Great Lakes, break into federal prisons to break out Confederate soldiers. This group was known as the Fifth Column, or the Confederate Knights Circle was another one of these groups that were kind of existing up here in the North. That was kind of a concern to many Northerners and to Lincoln and the Union as well. So does Lincoln violate civil rights? Well, you could argue, yes, he does. He suspends habeas corpus, he puts people in jail. Or was Lincoln trying to save the Union at a time of crisis? And you could say that too is true as well. So it really kind of decides on your argument. And remember, that's the cool thing about history is about arguing the past. It's about coming up with a conclusion based upon what you think are the important issues here at hand and what you would have done if you were Lincoln in 1860 during the Civil War. Would you have suspended habeas corpus? Would you have rounded up the leaders to save Maryland from seceding and joining the Confederacy? So interesting things to think about as we talk about this crisis developing in the Union during this time period in the 1860s. So we talked a lot today about this growing opposition in the North, that the war, as it's dragging on and it's not going very well, there is opposition in the Union. You have the Draft Riots, the draft, which is very unpopular, going on, and just lots of conflict occurring in the North. So again, thank you for listening. If you have questions about any of these topics, please make sure you come talk to your teacher. Thank you for listening.